with me. Please, you don't get to do this tonight.
Rain hammered the windshield of a battered delivery van on Route 9, just outside Millbrook, and Maren Calloway almost drove past the wreck entirely. A silver sedan sat crumpled against the guardrail, one headlight still burning weakly into the storm. Maren slowed, then stopped, then ran. Inside the car, an older man slumped over the wheel, his lips turning gray, his breath shallow and ragged. She didn't know his name, she didn't know his bank balance, his company, or the 21 years of silence that connected the two of them. All she knew was that a man was dying in front of her, and nobody else had stopped. She pulled him from the car, laid him on the wet asphalt, and began compressions, counting out loud so she wouldn't panic. She had no idea that the stranger's heart failing beneath her hands belonged to the father she had spent 2 decades trying to forget. It all started 3 weeks earlier, on an ordinary Tuesday morning that gave no warning of what was coming. Maren was 29 years old and had been driving for Swiftline Delivery for 6 years, hauling packages across 3 counties in a van with a cracked dashboard and a check engine light that never turned off. She worked 12-hour shifts, ate lunch behind the wheel, and spent every evening at her mother's bedside, because Louise Calloway's kidneys were failing and the treatments cost more than Maren made in a month. Louise had raised Maren alone since she was 8 years old, ever since the morning her father walked out the front door with a single suitcase and never called again. No fight, no explanation, just an empty driveway and a mother who cried quietly in the kitchen so her daughter wouldn't hear. For years, Maren told herself she didn't think about him. She told herself a lot of things, but some nights, folding laundry alone in a 1-bedroom apartment, she still wondered what she had done wrong at 8 years old to make a father disappear. What Maren didn't know was that 200 miles away, in a glass office tower that bore his name, a man named Desmond Hale had spent every one of those 21 years trying to find her, and failing for reasons that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with the people standing between them. Neither of them could have guessed that a rainstorm and a stretch of empty highway were about to undo 2 decades of silence in a single, terrifying night. And what Maren discovered in the days that followed would not just change her life. It would expose a lie that had been carefully protected for 21 years. Swiftline Delivery paid Maren by the stop, not the hour, which meant every red light and every slow customer cost her money she didn't have. On a Wednesday afternoon, a man named Harlan Voss yanked his door open before Maren's knuckles even landed on it. Phone already raised and recording. "You're 4 minutes late," he said, loud enough for the neighbor's yard to hear. "I'm reporting this." The package sitting in her hands was a decorative lamp he'd ordered on a whim. Nothing urgent. Nothing that couldn't have waited an hour. Maren apologized anyway, because a rating under 4 stars meant fewer routes the following week, and fewer routes meant a check too small to cover dialysis copays. Voss shut the door before she finished the sentence. 20 minutes later, with the pharmacy closing in 11 minutes and her mother's prescription sitting behind the counter, Maren abandoned 2 deliveries still in the back of her van and drove straight there, running the last block through the rain to reach the counter before the gate came down. She made it with 90 seconds to spare, soaked and out of breath, and paid with a card she already knew was close to its limit. Nobody at Swiftline would ever know 2 packages went out late that day, or why. Maren never explained. She simply absorbed the 1-star review that showed up on her account the next morning and kept driving. The only bright spot in her week was Sunday dinner with her mother, a ritual that had shrunk from a full meal to a bowl of soup once Louise's appetite started failing along with her kidneys. Maren picked up extra weekend shifts to cover the difference between what insurance paid and what dialysis actually cost, and some nights she sat in the Swiftline parking lot after her shift ended, running numbers in a notebook that never balanced. "You work too hard," Louise told her one evening, her voice thin but her eyes sharp. "You've been working too hard since you were 8 years old." "Somebody has to," Maren said, and immediately regretted the edge in her voice. Her mother reached for her hand instead of arguing. "He would be proud of you," Louise said quietly, "whatever else he was." Maren pulled her hand back gently. "Don't," she said. "We don't talk about him." It was a rule they had kept for 21 years, one Maren had built to protect herself, brick by brick, until the wall felt like part of who she was. What Maren didn't know was that her mother had broken that rule once, years earlier, when a private investigator hired by Desmond Hale had knocked on their door asking questions. Louise had turned him away out of fear, not spite, certain that any contact from her ex-husband's world would only bring more heartbreak. She had never told Maren that he tried, and little did Maren know, 3 weeks from that quiet Sunday soup, she would learn exactly why those attempts had stopped, and exactly who had made sure they did. The night of the crash, Maren was finishing her last route of the day, a small business delivery out past the Millbrook overpass, when the storm rolled in faster than the forecast had promised. She saw the sedan's taillights first, tilted at a wrong angle against the guardrail, steam rising off a crumpled hood. 3 other cars had already slowed and continued on. Maren pulled over without thinking twice, grabbed the first aid kit she kept behind her seat out of habit, and ran through the rain. The man inside looked to be in his 60s, dressed in an expensive coat now soaked through, his hands cold and his lips losing color. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt injury so much as the visible collapse of a body giving out on its own. Maren had taken a CPR course 2 years earlier for a job she never got. She had never once expected to use it on the side of a highway in the dark. She pulled him from the wreck, laid him flat, tilted his head, and began compressions, counting under her breath, her knees scraping against wet gravel. "Stay with me," she said, to a total stranger, the same way she said it to her mother some nights. "Stay with me. You don't get to do this tonight." When the paramedics finally arrived, one of them told her that another 2 minutes without compressions would have ended differently. Maren didn't ask his name. She didn't check his wallet. She gave her statement to the responding officer, watched the ambulance disappear into the rain, and drove home soaked and shaking, certain she would never see the man again. She had no way of knowing that the man's phone, recovered from the wreckage, held a single photograph pinned to the lock screen, a faded picture of a laughing 8-year-old girl standing in a driveway. And she had no way of knowing that before the night was over, a hospital administrator would be searching desperately for the exact person who had just saved his life, because that photograph carried her name written on the back. The call came the next morning while Maren was loading her van. A hospital administrator named Dr. Priya Anand introduced herself carefully, explaining that the man Maren had saved was stable, and asking, almost hesitantly, whether the name Calloway meant anything to her. Maren's stomach dropped before her mind caught up. "That's my last name," she said slowly. "Why?" Dr. Anand explained that the patient, a man named Desmond Hale, had been unconscious when he arrived, but that a photograph in his coat pocket had a name written on the back in fading ink. Maren, age 8. He had been carrying it, apparently, for 21 years. Maren sat in her van in the hospital parking lot for 11 minutes before she could make herself go inside. When she finally stood at the door of his hospital room, Desmond Hale was awake, pale, tethered to monitors, and utterly unprepared for the sight of her. His voice cracked on the first word he managed to say. "Maren, you know who I am," she said, not quite a question. "I have always known who you are," he said. "I just haven't been allowed anywhere near you." He told her haltingly that he had never intended to vanish. That, after the divorce, a custody arrangement had been manipulated by lawyers he trusted too much, and a second wife who wanted a clean break from his first family entirely. That letters had gone unanswered, not because Louise ignored them out of spite, but because most of them had never actually reached her, intercepted long before they left his own household. That every investigator he hired eventually stopped returning his calls, for reasons he only now suspected went deeper than incompetence. Maren wanted to believe him and hated herself a little for wanting to. 21 years is a long time to not find one address, she said quietly. "You're right," Desmond admitted, his eyes wet. "And I intend to find out exactly why it took this long, because someone made very sure that it did." Neither of them yet knew that the answer was sitting 3 floors up, in a private hospital suite paid for by Hale Industries, in the perfectly composed expression of the woman who had walked Desmond down the aisle 19 years earlier, and who had just been informed that his estranged daughter was back in his life. Camille Hale was standing in her kitchen, coffee halfway to her lips, when the call came in from the hospital's donor liaison, updating her, as a courtesy, on her husband's condition. "He's stable," the liaison said, "and Mr. Hale, we did want you to know, the woman who performed the roadside CPR has been identified as his daughter, Maren Calloway, Stens." The coffee cup didn't shake. Camille's voice stayed perfectly level. Thank you for letting me know." She ended the call, set the cup down, and dialed her son before she had even finished exhaling. "We have a problem," she told Preston the moment he picked up, "and we are going to solve it the way we always do." "The letters again?" Preston asked, and something in the ease of the question told its own story. He wasn't shocked. He had known, on some level, for years. "There were never any letters that mattered," Camille said. "I made certain of that in the first year, and I've made certain of it every year since. Your father grieved a daughter who never actually rejected him. He just never knew the difference." She said it the way another person might describe a business decision, flat and unbothered, because to her, that was exactly what it had always been. "And now she's back," Preston said. "Now she's back," Camille agreed. "Which means 19 years of careful work is sitting in a hospital bed, holding his hand. So we're going to go meet her, and we're going to be very, very warm." Preston met Maren for the first time in the hospital cafeteria, all warmth and expensive cologne, offering condolences for a childhood he clearly knew nothing real about. "It must be strange," he said, stirring his coffee. "Showing up now, of all times, right when he's vulnerable." "I didn't show up," Maren said evenly. "I pulled him out of a wrecked car." Preston smiled thinly. "Of course. Lucky timing." The implication sat in the air between them, ugly and deliberate. What Preston didn't say, and what Maren wouldn't learn for another week, was that Camille had already scheduled a meeting with the family's estate attorney, quietly asking how difficult it would be to have a will amended while its subject was still recovering, and how quickly an inheritance dispute might be resolved if the newly discovered daughter simply decided, on her own, that she wanted nothing to do with any of it. Camille found Maren alone in the hospital parking garage 4 days later, standing beside her delivery van with keys in hand. She introduced herself with practiced warmth, complimented Maren on her courage, and then, without changing her tone at all, offered her $400,000 to sign a document releasing any claim to the Hale estate, and quietly stepped back out of Desmond's life. "He's built a whole world since you left," Camille said gently. "A company, a family, a legacy. It would be a shame to complicate that now, when he's so fragile. This way, everyone gets to keep their peace, you included." Maren stood very still. $400,000 would clear her mother's medical debt 3 times over. It would mean no more parking lot notebooks that never balanced, no more 12-hour shifts, no more choosing between rent and dialysis copays. For one long, dizzying moment, she considered it. Then she thought of her father's voice cracking on her name after 21 years of silence, and the photograph he had carried since she was 8 years old, and she understood, all at once, exactly what Camille was actually offering her. Not peace, disappearance. The same disappearance someone had already engineered once. "You didn't just want him to lose me," Maren said slowly, watching Camille's composure flicker for the first time. "You made sure of it. That's what this is. You're not protecting anyone. You're finishing something you already started." Camille's smile thinned into something colder. "Careful, dear. Accusations without proof tend to make people look desperate, not brave." She left the folder of paperwork on the hood of Maren's van and walked away without waiting for an answer. That evening, when Desmond asked Maren gently why she seemed so far away, she almost said nothing, almost let the old habit of silence win the way it always had. Instead, for the first time in 21 years, she chose to tell Hale the truth. She placed Camille's folder on his hospital tray and told him everything. Desmond read the offer twice, his jaw tightening with every line. "She's done this before," he said quietly, "hasn't she? The investigators. The letters. All of it." Little did either of them know, the proof they needed was sitting in a storage unit 2 miles away, in 19 years of records that Desmond's oldest friend and chief of staff, Walter Camelu, had quietly kept copies of, just in case a day like this ever came. Walter Hartwell stepped up to the small stage as the room quieted. "Thank you all for another remarkable year of generosity," he began, then paused, searching the crowd. "Before we continue, I'd like to introduce someone. My daughter has spent the last 6 weeks working alongside your catering staff, your event teams, your security, learning this company from the ground up, the way I once did. Josephine, would you join me?" For a moment, nobody moved. Then a woman near the bar whispered, "Wait, Josie?" And the name rippled outward table by table, guests turning to stare at the caterer in the second-hand dress with dawning, disbelieving recognition. Bradley straightened his jacket too quickly. forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Priscilla's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips, her face draining of color, as the pieces she'd already half known assembled themselves in front of 500 witnesses instead of one hallway. And near the kitchen doors, Marcus stood frozen, a tray forgotten in his hands, watching the woman he'd pulled away from, as though he were seeing her for the first time. Josephine climbed the steps and took the microphone, steady. "For 6 weeks, I carried trays through this ballroom without my name," she said, her voice carrying clearly. "I learned who treats people with dignity when nothing is expected in return." Her eyes found Marcus across the room. "And I learned who treats people with cruelty when they believe no one important is watching." She turned toward Priscilla. "Ms. Winthrop has chaired this gala for 3 years. She's also spent 3 weeks manipulating schedules, threatening a caterer's livelihood over a family illness, and mocking staff she assumed could never touch her position." Gasps spread through the nearest tables. An older woman near the front covered her mouth. "As of tonight, the board has voted to remove her from every committee she chairs across the Hartwell Foundation." Priscilla's wineglass trembled in her hand. For the first time in 15 years of carefully guarded status, the entire room was staring at her, not with the admiration she'd spent a lifetime chasing, but with something far worse. The board voted that same afternoon to remove Camille Hale from every position tied to Hale Industries, and to revoke Preston's vice presidency, citing conflicts of interest that stretched back nearly 2 decades. Legal proceedings over the intercepted letters and diverted payments began within the month. Desmond had every reason to push for more, and the board fully expected him to. Instead, when a reporter asked afterward whether he intended to pursue criminal charges, he paused for a long moment and looked toward Maren before answering. "I lost 21 years I can't get back," he said. "I'm not interested in spending whatever years I have left making sure someone else loses everything too." The truth was the point, not their ruin. Camille left the building that day without her title, her office, or her son's inheritance, but with her freedom. Preston, humiliated in front of the very board he'd hoped to one day lead, resigned before he could be formally removed, and disappeared from Hale Industries entirely, though not before Maren received one unexpected email from him weeks later, short and unpolished, admitting that he had believed his mother's version of events for so long he'd never once questioned it, and that he was sorry, whatever that was worth now. "It's worth something," Maren wrote back. "Just not everything. That part's up to you now." Desmond used part of his own recovery to quietly settle Louise Calloway's medical debt in full, not as a bribe, and not as an apology dressed up as money, but simply because he had 2 decades of birthdays to make up for, and nowhere else he would rather start. Louise, wary at first, agreed to meet him only once Maren insisted it was truly her choice. The two of them sat across a kitchen table for 3 hours, and said very little that mattered about money at all. 6 months later, Maren still drove for Swiftline 3 days a week, not because she needed to anymore, but because she had built something honest there that she wasn't ready to walk away from. The other days, she worked alongside Walter and Camille, learning the company her father had built from the ground up, one honest conversation at a time, instead of one locked door. On the anniversary of the crash, Desmond drove out to Route 9 alone, and stood at the exact spot on the guardrail where a stranger in a delivery uniform had once refused to let him go. He left a single photograph tucked against the rail, the same faded picture of a laughing 8-year-old girl he had carried in his coat pocket for 21 years, now joined by a newer one beside it. Somewhere, people still walk out of driveways and never look back. Somewhere, families are still kept apart by people who mistake control for love. But this story is a reminder that the truth has its own patience, and that sometimes the person who saves your life is the one you spent half of it looking for. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments what you would have done in Maren's place, standing in that parking garage with an envelope of money in one hand and the truth in the other. Like this video, subscribe for more real stories about the families we lose and the ones we find again, and stay close, because the next story we're telling might be the one that breaks your heart in a whole new way.